In a dismal future, a blazing neon light from the past cuts a pathway toward tomorrow. Bounding into comics and Brett R. Smith present Escape from the Future.
Welcome to Escape from the Future. I'm your host and comic veteran, Brett R. Smith, and joining me today is Christian Toto from Hollywood and Toto. Great to see you.
Good to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so we're going to talk Godzilla Minus One. You and I were late seeing this, and everybody that I knew had already seen this and were absolutely over the moon, which really surprised me because this is, this isn't our Godzilla, which we're used to. Godzilla and Kong and Skull Island and that kind of universe that we've had in America. This is Toho Studios, the original producers of Godzilla. And, I grew up watching these, Godzilla versus Mothra, Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla. I mean, all that great stuff. I love it. But they're really strictly kind of B movies. You know, it's a guy in a suit running around, crushing miniature cars and tanks and little cities. And, they're like these movies that you watch on a Sunday morning as a kid and you just love it, right? But everybody that I know who went to go see this took like a wife or a girlfriend, and the women loved it. Everybody's like, including you telling me that your wife loved it. That really surprised me because chicks typically don't go to see monster or kaiju movies. However, I think the human aspect and the relationships among the people, which I think really grounds this movie in something that is relatable, was the ultimate offering to a female audience. And I just think that was a complete stroke of genius because this movie, it's got heart and soul. And I think ultimately it's a redemption story, but it's the fact that it's gotten rave reviews from a female audience, I think is maybe the most surprising thing, maybe above the budget.
It's interesting because you mentioned there are elements that appeal to women. Well, they appeal to everyone. I mean, I understand what you're saying and you're right, but I don't think as a guy sitting in a theater, I'm thinking, I can't wait for this moment to end because I want to go back to X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
That wasn't my emotion. I just enjoyed the story.
Mm-hmm.
But listen, good storytelling is good storytelling. It appeals to everyone. There's something universal about it. And the fact that they are able to blend this, let's not just make these characters, waste time until the Godzilla character comes back on screen, but actually make it part of the story and an integral part of the story too. It's just wonderful. And they make it look so easy, and there's such a confidence in the storytelling. You think, why can't more storytellers do that? And I know it's much harder than it looks, but it's both enjoyable and exasperating because we want more of these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I think this is it's a story about these characters rediscovering their humanity in the wake and wreckage of World War II. And that leads them to bonding and having these deep relationships with each other, even outside of Godzilla, because this is all post-World War II, after both bombs have been dropped. This movie has, I think, heart and soul. And like I said, it's a redemption story, not only for the lead character, but all of the characters. And I think typically the humans in monster movies are just cannon fodder. They get annihilated and smashed under the monster's foot. And that's kind of the extent of their contribution outside of trying to stop the monster, right? But with this movie, we have a group of characters that are compelling and relatable. We care about them, and therefore we fear for them. And for me, it's the first Godzilla movie that really brings things down to the perspective of the people on the ground, who are obviously the most vulnerable. And even from the standpoint of the camera work, much more shots of looking up at Godzilla rather than, kind of watching this guy in a suit kind of rampage over this set of little buildings and tanks and small cars. You're always looking up at this creature in the movie, and it's terrifying because he's huge.
Yeah.
Even in the opening sequence, he's only 30 feet tall. But at the same time, that's a really intense sequence.
It is. It's funny. the American versions of Godzilla in recent years, they've been watchable. The effects are very good. The action is fine, but they hire very good actors like Kyle Chandler and I think that the young actress from Stranger Things is Millie Bobby Brown.
Yeah, yeah, she was in the last one.
I'm thinking, why would you bother to hire name marquee talented actors and then give them nothing to do, nothing interesting to say?
Yeah.
We're there for Godzilla. Just throw in some has-been. We don't care. Why? It's a waste of resources and a waste of their time. But in this movie, the characters do matter. They do pop. They do count. And yeah, the redemption is all over the story, and not just the hero, but other figures as well. And I love the way the movie, and I just thought of this as you're talking about it, the way it interweaves actual history into a Godzilla movie. I mean, it's not just a reference or a passing notion, oh, World War II or this. No, it really is as if this happened, 80 years ago, whatever it is. And it's so interesting because it's apolitical, and yet it is politically aware, or at least aware of what happened, the ramifications, the fallout, the nuance. It just does so much right.
Yeah, so you wrote an article for Hollywood and Toto. The article you wrote is Godzilla Minus One is Toho's Top Gun Maverick. And obviously there are some similarities that I kind of picked up there from the standpoint of Toho sort of rebooting the original Godzilla from, I think, 1954, which I've seen a couple times, which is black and white. But talk about what you meant by it being Toho's Top Gun Maverick.
I think there's a couple of obvious ones. Like I said, it delves into political matters in a sense, but it's apolitical. It's certainly not woke in any way. There's no speeches, no lectures, no sort of wink, wink nudges here.
Right.
It's also quietly patriotic. Obviously Top Gun Maverick, you have these pilots who are willing to give their lives to their country, to do something good, to do something noble that they feel their country is worth fighting for. And there's so much of what we see in Godzilla where it's Japan. They just lost the war. They were an aggressor. And yet the people on the ground, they didn't vote for this. They didn't want this perhaps, but they do love their country. And they are willing to rally again after having so much loss and so much sacrifice and so much pain to fight the Godzilla menace. I mean, it's just so interesting. You talk about redemptive arcs. I think that was significant in Top Gun as well. Can Maverick, end his career on a high note? Can he find a love again? Can he prove that he is a good leader, that he still has value and worth? And of course, there's survivor's guilt. The main character in Godzilla, he's a kamikaze pilot who bailed on his mission.
Yeah.
He chickened out in a sense. And he's got guilt about that he's still alive while so many of his fellow pilots are gone. And in Top Gun Maverick, it's Maverick who's thinking, Goose is gone.
Yeah.
I couldn't save him. He haunts me. And then, my gosh, what if I make his son the new pilot? What if he loses his life? I mean, all this survivor's guilt going on. And obviously none of this is intentional. It's just art reflecting life and good art reflecting what we go through. But I just thought it was so interesting to kind of really think about it, how these two films, so wildly different, actually have a lot in common.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that main character in Godzilla Minus One, I'm trying to remember his name, Koichi. Basically, he suffers from just total PTSD and, like you said, survivor's guilt, which reminds me of some vets that I know personally. It's something that they struggle with all the time.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it was very relatable to me, because then I could draw upon my own relationship with some of my friends who served. The story among these characters I also found to be really sincere and wholesome. They're the kind of characters and stories which Hollywood used to tell, because they used to focus on stories which were relatable to a wide audience and not just catering to small niches like they do now. And I think that that's another aspect of it which compares perfectly to Top Gun Maverick.
You mentioned two words, sincere and wholesome. And I think those words are like garlic to a vampire when it comes to Hollywood. There's nothing wrong with those two words. It can be cheesy, it can be melodramatic, it can be over the top. But there's something about our culture today, especially our pop culture, where everything has to be cynical and skeptical and wink, wink. And the best you get is maybe meta, where you have references to other movies or just pop culture in general. But something sweet and sincere is hard to pull off because you don't want to go too far. And I think Hollywood just often just ignores that or doesn't go there. And I
Yeah.
think that's a shame. It reminds me a little bit of the recent Superman films. And for a while, it's like Hollywood didn't even know what to do with Superman because he was this Boy Scout.
Mhm.
He was kind and he was decent and he was noble. And that was the Christopher Reeve that we grew up watching. And the newer version was darker and conflicted. And there's nothing really wrong with that. But I don't think Hollywood even knew how to do a Christopher Reeve version. I think that would stump them.
I think you're right. I recently watched Richard Donner's Superman, the movie from 1978, and there's that great line, where he says to Lois,
I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
and she just laughs, because she, even in 1978, that was a bit cynical. And she
Yeah.
just says something like, you're going to be fighting every politician in America, and he just says, Lois, I never lie. And from then on, you believe it. You not only believe this man can fly, which was the tagline of the movie, brilliant tagline, you'll believe a man can fly.
Perfect.
But also, it's just Chris. It's Chris's demeanor. It's not just the words. It's his demeanor. It's the way he pulls it off. It's everything. And one of the things that Donner really stressed in that movie was believability. In fact, he had this sign created, which said verisimilitude, and it had a Superman, Kurt Swan's drawing of Superman swooping in verisimilitude in the Superman logo. And he had that hanging over the set the entire time because he knew that this couldn't be corny. It couldn't be campy. Everybody's got to play this straight in order to make it believable. And this movie, 100% verisimilitude. And I can't really think of a higher compliment. But these characters are so relatable. We genuinely care about them and their survival.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you get such great dramatic tension, and that keeps getting ratcheted up as the film draws to its final act. And I can't remember the last time that Hollywood created a third act, which was really, really satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
I go to Top Gun Maverick. I think the last Mission Impossible movie certainly had a satisfying third act, but I always seem to have a problem with the third acts because, and I just don't know if the writers these days can write third acts or they know which direction to go, or maybe there's not enough invested in the first two acts in order to pull off a satisfying third act. But you have so much invested in these characters by the time the third act rolls around. I just felt like with Top Gun Maverick, I was watching kind of a throwback.
It's so funny you mentioned the third act. I think third acts are harder to write because you got to take all the elements. You've got to have it come to a crescendo.
Right.
I just recently watched for the first time The Equalizer 3, the third movie in their franchise, and I had low expectations. It was on Netflix, and I missed it. It was out a few months ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was shocked how good it was. Denzel is always at the top of his game, and the third act, it's a setup, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I can't wait to see what happens in the finale. And it's one of the more disappointing finales I've seen in a very long time. Almost like they just shrugged their shoulders and said, "Hey, we put out a pretty good movie. I think we're done for the day." And you're right about it. I mean, the third act really has to really pop. It so often doesn't, and it's a shame. And these examples we're talking about where it does, it's almost magical. And one other thing I want to mention about Godzilla Minus One is that, like you, I watched the movies as a kid. I've watched a little bit of them recently, and to say they haven't held up well, it's as kind a thing as you can say. But I remember then and now that some of the music from the Godzilla movies was spectacular. Even in Destroy All Monsters, that was my favorite one as a child. And watching the new Godzilla movie, they do incorporate some of the themes, some of the strains musically of those classic movies. And it sent my nostalgia circuits soaring. I couldn't believe it. Plus, it was in the service of a great movie. And I was just so happy and so tickled and so pleased. I thought that's honoring the source material in the very best of ways.
Well, and like Top Gun Maverick, you're giving the original audience something to be nostalgic over and to recognize, and then that warms your heart and gets you excited because you're seeing something familiar. But for people who are younger and didn't grow up watching that stuff, it's still just as intense and awesome. It might be something new for them, but to reuse some of the old themes and repurpose them.
Yeah.
I thought was a masterstroke. And then on top of that, Godzilla's roar, which I've watched a couple of videos on YouTube as to how they originally created that, which was running a leather. They would put on a leather glove and run it over a bass, a stand-up bass over the strings, and that's part of where you get kind of that signature sound, which almost sounds sort of like a horn or sort of like a stringed instrument. I didn't even know it was a bass. I thought maybe it was like a trumpet or a sax or something. I had no idea, but the fact that it was a bass, I thought was really interesting, because the strings on a bass, they're like huge cables, right? but like they rosined up this leather glove and then run it across it real slow, and then obviously combined with other elements. But I love the fact that it's organic.
By the way, I just want to mention, you told that story about Richard Donner and how he kept that spirit in the film and how he had those signs all around the set. That is a story I heard years ago, and it's one of those stories that cuts me to the quick, where I get goosebumps. And I remember that, you and I are very cynical of Hollywood. We're very critical of it, certainly of some of its ideological components today. But that's why I got into doing what I do, for those moments, for that anecdote, for the love of cinema that Donner had and the results that it came. And I just want to mention that because I just think it's so special. And for all the times we rail against Hollywood and have problems with it, when you hear that story, it just cuts to the chase, and it's just magic.
Yeah, George Carlin said that if you scratch the surface of a cynic, you'll find a disappointed optimist. And growing up in the 80s and 90s, and even watching those movies, as well as the movies from the 70s, from all of those USC mafia guys, or they're also called the Dirty Dozen, Coppola, De Palma, Lucas, Milius, Spielberg, Zemeckis. These guys, they loved film. They lived, breathed, ate, slept cinema, and they had huge regard for the filmmakers that had came before them, and you could see all the influences. Donner's another one of those guys who's made some of my favorite films, some of the most signature films of that era. And I think it's just the love of cinema that comes through all of their films, even the ones which we might say were weak or weaker than others. They're still fantastic films. And I found that same love and appreciation from, what's his name? The director's name of Godzilla Minus One is Takashi Yamazaki. He's also the writer. And I could just tell that this guy loved the original 1954 film, had reverence for it, and wanted to maintain that, but at the same time, give it something fresh and new. And again, this is another comparison to Top Gun Maverick, where, what's his name? Kaczynski? I mean, obviously love the source material. Tom loves the source material. It's obviously important to stick to it, but also give something fresh and new. And it's another reason why I think your article is brilliant, because that's a comparison that I didn't originally think of when I went to go see it. But I had read your spoiler-free article before or after I went to go see it, and I was just blown away, because I was like, oh, that's so spot on. It's Toho's Top Gun Maverick. It's perfect.
Well, thank you for the kind words. One other thing that I think I mentioned in the story is that when Hollywood has a hit, they duplicate it. When Halloween was a big slasher film sensation in the late 70s, we got Friday the 13th and dozens of copycats. And it's too soon to see copycats of Top Gun Maverick, but you'd like to think that Hollywood would be studying that film and why it was successful and the elements that popped for theater goers, and thinking, oh gosh, even if we don't make another movie about pilots or things like Maverick or characters like Maverick, why did that work? Why did that connect with people? It isn't just nostalgia, because I guarantee you they can bring out a half dozen more remakes and reboots and sequels that'll fail. This was special. This was different. Study it, learn it, appreciate it, figure out what makes it tick. And I think that would make you produce better movies.
I think it comes down to what we were talking about, which is sincerity and verisimilitude. But really, I love the idea of films being sweet and sincere and having touching moments, because that's how you build rapport and connect with the characters, and that's how you invest in these films. And ultimately, that's what moves us. That's what creates emotion. You know, it feeds our heart and our souls. And one of the things about this movie that I noticed right off the bat was there's no cheesy or snarky humor in this. There's no goofy one-liners. There's no quips. There's no forced humor. There's no campiness. There's at no point in time during the action sequences does somebody say something like, "Hey, got any tape? Does anybody have any tape?" You know, and then you're completely pulled out of the movie. You're like, what? If characters are having an intimate, sweet moment, or even an intense moment where they're fighting and they're having conflict, there's no snarkiness. At no point are you pulled out of the movie or your suspension of disbelief is eliminated. You know, this film pulls no punches and is totally authentic and maintains the believability in what's going on from start to finish. It never lets up.
Makes all this. I kind of want to see it again. I just saw it a couple of weeks ago, so it's.
I know. I saw it on New Year's Day, and you know, we went to go and see a movie on New Year's Day because we typically go and see movies on Wednesdays, like first showings or like afternoon movies, because there's typically nobody there, right? Yeah. So I figured New Year's Day, everybody's out the night before, they're partying, they're drinking, everybody's gonna be hungover. It's gonna be an empty theater, and we went to the theater, and it was about half full, which just blew my mind. And I could tell there was probably some people in there that were on their second or third viewing. A couple people were wearing Godzilla t-shirts. There were couples. There were multiple couples, not just Lisa and I. And there was a girl by herself as well. And I was just blown away. I was just kind of like, this is not what I expected on New Year's Day. And certainly this is not what I expected from a Godzilla movie. I figured it would be wall-to-wall dudes. But it reinforced what I had heard up until that point, which is everybody loves this movie. Man, woman, child, you know, it's probably a little intense for a kid, but I think, you know, if I'm a 9 or 10-year-old kid, you totally handle this movie, you know.
I actually, you know, I know it did well in theaters in the US. 40 or 50 million, that kind of comes to mind. I could be off a little bit, but I almost think if they re-released it in a few weeks, you know, because January and February are really quiet times for movies, not a lot of big hits. Right. A lot of the iffy movies are dropped around this time of the year. You just kind of reposition it again and let that word of mouth kind of bubble up. I mean, I was able to see it at home via screening link. I might go to the theater and see it. And I don't know, maybe it's already attracted all the audience it'll attract, but
I don't know.
Part of me thinks it could get a second wave.
Well, Top Gun Maverick had that. It was re-released because I saw it in the theater originally, and then I think about, I don't know, 6 or 7 months later, maybe a year later, it was re-released, and we went and saw it again on my birthday. Funny enough, Wednesday afternoon. There's nobody there. We had the entire theater to ourselves, so it was the perfect birthday present to me. But yeah, man. I think it would be a stroke of genius to re-release this. It's just now leaving theaters. In fact, I think this week is it's ending its run. But I think it'd be a masterstroke to keep this in theaters or re-release it, because just the word of mouth and the buzz surrounding it is enough guerrilla marketing, I think, to get more people back in there. I also wanted to see it on the screen. As much as I love watching stuff at home, I kind of felt that just the spectacle and also the sound, because one of the big things in this movie is the sound. It makes the movie very intense. Some of the scenes where Godzilla is rampaging through the city and that tail comes whipping around and just lays waste to buildings. It is so loud and so intense, and you're kind of breathless. The atomic breath also blew my mind. You know, we're all used to seeing Godzilla just shoot this atomic flame, blue atomic flame out of his mouth and hit things, but this is like a nuclear weapon going off. I mean, it is literally like another atomic bomb. And then it got me thinking about how Godzilla, in a lot of ways, is sort of an analogy to America. You awaken this sleeping giant monster that comes over and breathes atomic breath on 2 of your cities. It got me thinking in a lot of ways about how Godzilla came about, and just kind of the whole idea And I'm not sure if anyone's ever made that comparison. They probably have. But for me, that's when it kind of dawned on me, in a lot of ways, what this creature is to the Japanese.
By the way, I just thought of another comparison between this and Top Gun. If you look at Rotten Tomatoes, for the longest time, I think Top Gun was like maybe 96, 97% fresh, and the audience rating was about the same.
Mm-hmm.
When I checked out the Godzilla Minus One on Rotten Tomatoes, it was like 98, 98.
Wow.
So perfect unanimity, high score. I mean, you just don't get that very often.
Yeah. Something else, I really liked how they dealt with the war. It wasn't something I was anticipating, but they criticized the Japanese government when it comes to controlling information and spreading propaganda, and also being completely unreliable to answer this new threat to the country. I mean, they make no bones about it. They're just like, nobody is coming to save us. We have to self-rescue. The characters come to that conclusion that the government is not the answer here. Instead, they have to take matters into their own hands to solve this problem. And I'm sitting here thinking, this movie is anti-government, pro-freedom, pro-traditional relationships, given the time that it's set in, which is obviously post-World War II. And I was just thinking to myself, like Top Gun Maverick, it has all of these traditional aspects, but also kind of right of center leanings, which are not overt in any way, but in a lot of ways, the characters are speaking our language. You know what I mean? Which I thought was something that was, I was not expecting that at all, which is something else. I was just kind of smiling throughout the whole movie.
I don't disagree, but I think if this movie had come out 20 years ago, I don't know if you'd make that comment. I don't think it
Probably
would be
not
as apparent, but I think you're right. And I think right now it does speak to something going on culturally.
Yeah. So this movie had a very small budget. Originally, it was reported to be 15 million. Now I'm hearing that it's closer to 11 million. Takashi Yamazaki said that he would have loved to have had 15 million, but they didn't. So the filmmakers had to do more with less. And I think they accomplished it in a big way because they tell this great story with compelling characters, and they're not reliant on having to distract the audience with big, flashy special effects from start to finish. They've got a great story. So there's a great balance, I think, between the personal story of the people and what they're going through and the obstacles they obviously have to overcome. But then you've also got a perfect balance of that and the monster and the devastation.
I don't disagree, but it does need to show the razzle dazzle.
Yeah.
And you need budget for that, and you need special effects, and it delivers. And it delivers in a way that doesn't say, oh, I can tell this is a little cheaper. Like, I never thought about that. I don't think I even knew about the budget issue before I saw it. So I just went in cold, and I'm thinking, okay, this had enough of a budget to produce a Godzilla effect, for better or worse. And I never thought at any point that this is a lower budgeted entry. It reminds me, I think 2023 might go down with this movie and The Creator, which I believe was 85-ish million.
Yeah.
Which looked sensational. Almost as good, if not better, than most films.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, hey, Hollywood, you gotta tighten up these budgets. Something you can do this. This can be done, but you can't keep spending $300 million on these movies, praying that they're successful in a massive way. The numbers just don't add up. You've got to figure out how to rein this in. And like these movies are showing it can be done. Just figure it out. Yeah,
I remember watching the previews and then hearing that this was a $15 million film. And I just said to myself, that's impossible. They can't do all that CGI for that little. And then when I went and saw it, and having a little bit of a trained eye myself, I could tell what they were doing practically with practical effects and what they were doing with special effects. In some cases, I couldn't tell at all, which is always a sign of special effects doing their job. When you can tell it's CGI, it's not doing its job. Somebody posted the other day, post a GIF of your favorite special effects sequence. And I kept thinking to myself, well, if it's doing its job right, you don't know that it's a special effects sequence. And I think about Master and Commander and how beautifully they blended practical and visual effects with that, to where I still have a really hard time kind of figuring out what is what are 3/4 inch models and what is pure CGI, and then what is a blend of practical effects and CGI. Nolan, the Dark Knight trilogy is I think one of the best examples of practical effects and CGI because he loves to integrate them together. But most of the time, Nolan likes to use practical effects because he said read this article where he said it's just more fun. It's more fun for the crew, for the director. It's more fun for the actors. He said, I can't think of something more demoralizing and depressing than showing up to shoot and it's just a wall of green screen.
Yeah.
He's got these guys running around in green suits with little balls, taped to their head. But with regard to the special effects shots, they're done with Godzilla Minus One. They're done in a very convincing and dramatic way. And the filmmakers were smart to use them only, I think, when necessary and when was needed. The film has a great balance, like I said, of this wonderful human story where it's obviously sets and practical effects. And then you have the monster, which I think was a blend, but it's not wall-to-wall CGI because it just wasn't necessary.
And also, I think your eye instinctively knows what's real and what's fake, even if it's beautifully rendered. So when you're watching something, there's something on a very deep level where you want to have that tactile nature. And I think if you can blend the two and have enough of that practical, that your mind will maybe do the rest in your head.
Yeah. So this director, Takashi Yamazaki, is the writer, the director, and the head of the special effects. So I think having that triple threat is kind of like having James Cameron on the set leading things. He knows where to use practical effects and when to use CGI and when to integrate them. And I would imagine that's probably how they were able to keep costs down and ultimately, at the end of the day, do more with less.
It's an interesting note, and I mean, it's almost like having a stunt coordinator who becomes a director. And I believe that may be the case in maybe one of the Deadpool films. I'm kind of shooting at the hip there, but it sounded vaguely familiar. But yeah, that's a great advantage. And if you know how to do it, you know how to cut corners. I mean, that's what indie filmmakers do all the time. They do more with less. They have resources that are just not at their disposal. They've got to figure things out. They've got to shoot on less time. And they've got to figure out, when things go awry, they've got to compromise or, improvise. And often that creates great moments. And, I've talked to a lot of directors who share those little inspirations like, hey, we had no choice. We didn't have a plan B. We had to do this and then we had to do that. And often there's magic in there. Yeah,
I think among creatives, sometimes when you have to do more with less and you have a small budget, you end up being more creative. And you end up with things that are better because it's easy to just go and rely on CGI. It reminds me of Blade Runner, which had a tiny budget for the special effects, not very big at all. Doug Trumbull said that they wish they had more, but they didn't. So they had to do more with less, which is why a lot of it is shot in silhouette. A lot of it has tons of smoke, which also comes from the storyline. But even RoboCop, Paul Verhoeven had a very small budget on that movie. I think $13-14 million. And you just think about that's pre-CGI. This is all practical effects. You got Rob Bottin as one of the great special effects guys out there. But I just think that in a lot of ways, I think it's better to have these smaller budgets because you are the directors are compelled to get creative and to figure things out. And Hollywood used to be all about movie magic and tricking our eye and doing all these amazing things in Hollywood, right? On the set, not so much in a computer or with special effects. They're tricking your eye in the camera and it looks so believable. And I think about all the great matte paintings and miniatures, which you learn about years later. Oh, that's a matte painting. That's painted on glass and then integrated into this shot with real structures or terrain. I just think that Hollywood's lost that. They rely too much on CGI. It's become a crutch.
Yeah, and I think in recent years there's been this acknowledgement that CGI was pushed too far. And then even J.J. Abrams, a flawed director, when he did the Star Wars new films, he really was more aggressive in making the practical effects stand out and leaning on them more than usual. I think there's been and especially in horror. I mean, horror, magic words to a horror movie fan are practical effects. So that's their bread and butter. And I get it. And it's good to it's good to acknowledge the ability of one set of tools, but understand you need as much of the real world as possible.
Yeah, I mean, they're amazing tools, but they have limitations. And not only limitations from the standpoint of how believable they can look, but also limitations based on the budget. And there's a reason why there's like, I don't know, something like Chuck Dixon told me there's like 800 mid-level budget horror movies right now in production, whether they're in pre-production, production, or post-production. But Hollywood is going to start cranking out the mid-level budget horror movie. And
Good. That's money, man.
it is money, and they're able to do more with less, meaning they're able to make more movies with smaller budgets, and that way we're going to get more volume, which is something I've been, highly critical of Hollywood for a long time, that they just don't make enough stuff every year, and so we're left with, maybe half a dozen of these huge blockbusters, these 250, $300 million movies, which everything is riding on, right? So spread out your risk, and you can probably do that more easily with horror. I'm also hoping that the return of the mid-level action movie is also going to give us more, right? Because
or even comedies, by the way, they should not be. They should be wildly inexpensive. I mean, you don't even need any gore makeup in a comedy. You just need a couple of people falling on a banana peel. I mean, what could be easier? But we don't see as much.
You ought to be spending that money on a great cast and a great lead and somebody really funny. I mean, that those kind of resources should be going to hire like stars.
Yep.
So, but Godzilla, it's ultimately a dramatic thriller about people trying to rebuild their lives in the wake of World War II and the total devastation of Japan. I think it's all about that, but it's very cleverly disguised as a monster movie in a lot of ways. And after being a broken people, it's Godzilla which unites them and gives them this purpose to unite so they can survive and rebuild. And I just think that having that emotional anchor to the movie made it so much more than just a monster movie, and made me really love the characters.
Yeah. And made my wife sit there and watch it, enjoy it, and tell a friend. That's the oddest compliment from any Godzilla movie in the history of movies, is my wife liking it.
When was the last time a Godzilla movie got you choked up? Because it got me choked up at a couple points in time, especially the PTSD and the survivor's guilt. That really got to me. I thought that was just a master stroke, and something that you don't often think about when you think about the Japanese, especially when it comes to kamikaze pilots, which is today's suicide bomber, essentially.
I also love the fact that your hero in the movie is flawed in a certain sense from the jump. Now, we may not approve of kamikaze pilots, but he was a soldier in the army, and he bailed on his mission and on his colleagues. And that's a flawed character to a certain degree. Right. He didn't do it because he was a pacifist. He did it because he was afraid.
He's afraid.
And so we have this character who's going to, anchor the movie. And right from the jump, he's no Mary Sue. He's this guy with a lot of issues going on. It's fascinating.
Yeah. And even at the end of the movie, I mean, he's still got a lot of issues, you know what I mean? But at the same time, and I don't want to give the ending away for people who might not have seen it, but that was another twist I did not see coming, was how it ended up. I figured he would just kind of soldier on alone, but I'm glad that it didn't end up that way. And again, it made for a much more satisfying third act, and you walked out of the theater feeling good, which is another comparison to Top Gun Maverick. It doesn't happen often enough where you walk out of a theater on a high and feeling good about humanity and the characters and their struggles and what they've overcome. So much of the time with Godzilla movies, Godzilla is everything, right? Because he's usually put in a position where he's fighting another monster in order to save Japan, and it becomes sort of this territorial.
He's not the good guy. He's good adjacent sometimes in more recent years. So
right, and this was a return to the Godzilla, which is not a good thing. It is. It's the ultimate disaster. Hitting Tokyo and Japan. Sure. But it's funny. At the end of the day, Godzilla Minus One is traditional storytelling 101. Compelling characters you love and relate to, and the relationships they have among each other, plus a common goal or obstacle to overcome together, which pushes them all to their absolute limits. Again, there's no agendas, there's no activism in this movie. It's just pure escapist entertainment, which is ultimately why we've always gone to the movies.
Mm-hmm. And always enjoyed Godzilla in lesser variations, I'll put it that way.
Okay, so last question. Will Hollywood learn any lessons from Godzilla Minus One?
I mean, I have to be skeptical and cynical until we see proof of of some sort of awakening. I don't anticipate it. And also, it wasn't a box office spectacular film. They did very well. It's surprising. It's a sleeper, but it didn't do like Sound of Freedom numbers. So
right.
I don't know. But they should learn. I mean, especially since, well, I think we're getting a new Godzilla movie very soon.
We are.
It's already in the can. So I just hope so. I mean, I think you have to. I think if you're a studio executive in Hollywood, you've got to look at these stories and think, what they do right? How can we, process it? How can we duplicate it?
And that's something they used to do. They used to reverse engineer all the successful stuff, which is why, we got movies like Speed, which is Die Hard on a bus. That was kind of the modus operandi in Hollywood, was take something successful and replicate it over and over and over again until people are completely sick of it and stop going to see it.
Right.
So anyway, sadly, we're out of time. Christian, why don't you give everyone your social media coordinates and also let us know how our viewers can support you.
Gotcha. Well, I am at hollywoodintoto.com. That's my website, updated 7 days a week. On Twitter, it's at hollywoodintoto. And of course, the podcast, weekly podcast with some bonus episodes each weekend. That is Hollywood in Toto Podcast. Got to keep that brand alive and well and use that name. It's a blessing and a curse.
Awesome. Thanks so much, man. Really appreciate it. We'll do it again.
Sounds good.
For more videos like this one, tune in and subscribe to the Bounding into Comics channel on YouTube and Rumble. Also, make sure and like this video and leave us a comment and let us know what you thought of Godzilla Minus One. Thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll see you next time.